There are villages that no longer appear on maps, paths overgrown with weeds, names forgotten by the living, but not by the dead. In the folds of a mist-covered mountain, where lanterns glow dim even at noon, they still remember the bride they buried in clay. Remember the bloodline that dared to betray her, and remember the curse that only sleeps between generations. This is not a story of love. It is a story of debt, of rituals whispered through teeth stained with vermilion, of a river that runs dry but still drowns those who disobey. Tonight, on Folk Fear, we follow the footsteps of a grieving son who returns to his ancestral home for a funeral, only to find a wedding already underway. A wedding between the living and something far older and far more patient. This is the tale of the bride locked in clay. And once you hear her name, she might start calling yours.
The rain had stopped, but the earth still wept. Min Lian stepped off the bus and sank ankle-deep into mud that clung like fingers. The tires hissed away behind him, taking the last sounds of the city with them. Before him stretched a path, not paved, not gravel, but clay, cracked and red, as if it remembered blood. On either side, the mist swallowed the trees whole. He tightened the strap of his satchel and began walking, unsure if the chill that crept up his spine came from the fog or from the silence. Yunsi Village, a name barely whispered in the government registries, a place he'd only visited once as a child, during a summer his mother never spoke of again. Now she was dead, and her will said one thing: "Take me home." Walked the clay path. No address, no funeral parlor, just that one line. Min had laughed at the absurdity of it until her urn arrived in the mail with the old wax seal of Yunsi's ancestral council. The seal was cracked, and something inside the urn rattled. The trees grew thicker. Branches reached toward him like gnarled arms. The clay path darkened beneath his feet, wet again, though the sky remained dry. Somewhere far off, a bell rang, soft, hollow, and irregular. Not the bell of a temple, the bell of warning. When Min reached the village gate, he saw no one waiting, no welcome, just an old wooden archway etched with glyphs faded by time, and beneath it a tangle of red thread, tied in knots only Taoist priests dared undo. A sign dangled from a bamboo post: "Ghost marriage ceremony in progress. Outsiders must not speak the bride's name." He frowned. "Bride?" he muttered aloud. "Speak low, child." The voice came from behind him, old, raspy, and breathless. A hunched woman stood there, robes dragging through the mud, her eyes clouded like river stones. She held a bowl of ashes. Red paper burned faintly at the center. "You are Min Liang," she said, without question. "How do you—" "Your mother told us you would return. She knew her time was short." The woman turned and began walking. "Come, the offering is waiting." Min hesitated. "I didn't come for rituals. I just came to bury her." The old woman paused. "She has already been buried, but her debt has not." The village hadn't changed. Still the same half-rotten thatched roofs, the same bone-dry well in the center square, the same statues of faceless guardians at every gate. But the silence, it was heavier now. Not just quiet, but listening. Red banners fluttered weakly between homes, etched with ink that bled into the fabric. Red paper effigies lined the street, bent in windless air. At the far end of the village, where the earth dipped toward the riverbank, men saw it. 2 life-sized clay figures seated under a ceremonial canopy. A ghost wedding. 1 bride, 1 groom, neither living. The figures were eerily human in posture. The groom's face had collapsed slightly, exposing teeth made of polished bone. The bride sat taller, her clay veil dripping water onto the ground, though no rain fell. Her hands were folded in her lap, delicate, precise, almost graceful. "They're just statues," men whispered. The old woman shook her head. "Not after tonight." Inside his family's ancestral house, dust coated everything in layers like sediment. The walls bowed inward slightly, as if the home was sighing under the weight of its own secrets. On a low wooden table sat his mother's urn. It looked different here, heavier, more solemn. Its ceramic lid had cracked on the way. He reached for it. "Wait," a man's voice. Min turned to see his uncle, gray-haired, stooped, and dressed in plain linen robes, Uncle Yao, a man his mother hadn't spoken to in years. "She told me to bring her back," Min said. Yao nodded, eyes on the urn. "And she told you to walk the path?" "She didn't tell me anything else." "Then she knew you wouldn't believe." That night they gathered in the shrine hall. Candles lined the room, each flame no taller than a finger. The air was thick with the scent of sandalwood and something sour beneath it, mildew or perhaps mold. Min sat near the back, away from the elders who chanted in low broken dialects he barely recognized. The statues had been moved inside. The groom had cracked again. His arm lay shattered on the floor, revealing a hollow core filled with dried herbs, nails, and something disturbingly like hair. The bride remained intact, too intact. Her clay eyes seemed wet. Her mouth was closed, but there were lines around the lips, like she had once smiled or screamed. The shaman stepped forward. His face was hidden behind a painted mask, half red, half black. He carried a brush made from fox fur and dipped it into a bowl of ink made from crushed bone ash. "Men Lin, blood of the betrayers, come forward," he intoned. Min rose instinctively, unease crawling up his spine. "What is this?" "Your mother gave her blood 7 years ago. It postponed the curse." "Curse?" "You are the last of your line. You must seal the bond, or the bride will walk alone." "And if I refuse?" The wind outside howled, though no doors were open. The bride's statue trembled, and then a drop of water or blood rolled from the corner of her eye. Min left the shrine in a daze. The elders didn't follow, neither did his uncle. He walked the village paths aimlessly, moonlight barely breaking through the fog. His mother had never spoken of curses, only of silence and of clay. He passed the riverbed, now dried and cracked. The same clay that made the path, the same clay used to form the bride. In the distance he heard music, a soft broken melody played on a hulusi, the breathy Chinese flute used in mourning rites. He followed the sound, heart pounding. At the edge of the forest, beneath an old fig tree, he saw her. A woman in red, barefoot, veiled, still. But she was not made of clay. She turned slightly, her veil fluttering as if stirred by breath, and Min, frozen to the spot, realized with cold horror that she was looking at him. Even through the veil, he felt it. And she smiled. Not sweetly, not sadly, but knowingly, as if she'd been waiting. By morning, the fog had thickened, It pressed against the windows like a living thing, unwilling to let the light in. The village seemed smaller in the daylight, as if the mist had eaten part of it overnight. Min hadn't slept. The woman in red haunted the corners of his vision every time he closed his eyes. Her veil, the curve of her neck, that smile, it had been no hallucination. He stood at the threshold of his mother's ancestral home, breathing in the damp, clay-scented air. The house creaked behind him, wood swelling from the humidity, groaning with age. Somewhere upstairs, incense still smoldered from the funeral vigil. The urn was quiet now, but last night he could have sworn it shifted. Down by the village's edge, a group of men were gathered near the dried riverbed. Their tools clinked faintly, not the ringing of metal on stone, but of bone and wood. They were digging with care, carving into the cracked earth with tools wrapped in red cloth. Min approached slowly. No one greeted him. One man, elderly, faced like old bark, raised a hand in warning, but said nothing. Another, younger, glanced at him with eyes wide and rimmed in red. It wasn't anger, it was fear. He stepped closer, and then he saw it. Half buried in the mud was a face, smooth and pale, sculpted from clay. A woman's face, not a statue, not a mask. A head with eyes shut in peace or pain, lips parted slightly as if caught in the middle of a breath. It wasn't the bride from the shrine. This one was older, wetter. The clay shimmered faintly in the light, and tiny insects crawled along its hairline. Someone had tried to bury her again. Min felt a pulse in his ears. His mouth went dry. "She was supposed to stay buried," said a voice behind him. Uncle Yao. "The river was sacred once," Yao said, walking slowly beside him. "It was the lifeblood of Yunxi, but after the first betrayal, the river began to rot." Min frowned. "What betrayal?" Yao didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the trees just beyond the riverbed. A gnarled grove stood there, its trunks twisted as if reaching for something they could never grasp. "That's where they found the hairpin last time," Yao whispered. Min turned. "What hairpin?" Yao's face darkened. "Your mother never told you. She was trying to protect you from this place, from the curse." "I don't believe in curses," Min said automatically, even as the words felt brittle. Neither did she, until the bride came to her, in dreams, in mirrors, in your face. A long silence. Min's voice was quiet. "Is that why she left?" Yao nodded. "She broke the blood pact, left the village, refused to give her offering. And now? Now she has paid." That evening, Min walked the edge of the dried river, watching as the last of the clay face was wrapped in red silk and placed in an iron box. It was carried back toward the shrine by the elder men, their hands shaking as they moved. He lingered behind, staring at the spot where the clay head had rested. The mud was darker there, richer. He reached down on impulse, fingers pressing into the cool earth. Something metallic scraped against his nail. He pulled. A hairpin emerged from the clay, long, silver, elegant. Its tip was shaped like a phoenix wing, and red thread wrapped its base. It was beautiful, ancient. The moment he touched it, the wind stopped. The leaves froze mid-quiver, and then a voice, soft, delicate, almost like a lullaby, whispered through teeth. "Do you know my name?" Min's hand snapped open, but the hairpin stayed in his palm. He stumbled back, dropping it. It fell with a sound too loud for such a small object, like bone hitting stone. Behind him, the forest rustled. He turned, heart racing, and saw a woman in red just beyond the tree line. Still, silent, the same figure from last night. This time, she wasn't smiling. Min returned to the house just after sunset. Uncle Yao was waiting, seated cross-legged by the ancestral altar. A pot of herbal tea steamed beside him, but the air still felt cold. Yao gestured for Min to sit. He did, reluctantly. "You found the hairpin," Yao said. Min didn't answer. "You should not have touched it." "I didn't know what it was." "It doesn't matter." Yao poured tea. "The moment it recognizes you, the pact begins to unravel." "What pact?" Min asked, frustration creeping in. "No one will explain anything directly. What does this bride want? Why this ritual? Why me?" Yao stared into his cup for a long time before answering. "She was a Taoist's daughter, pure-blooded, promised to the mountain gods. But a warlord, a man your ancestor served, wanted her power, so he took her, killed her, and married her corpse in secret." Min felt the blood drain from his face. "It's not just a legend," Yao continued. "The warlord was real. So was the Taoist. He cursed the entire valley, bound her soul to an object of her choosing. She chose the hairpin because it was the last thing her mother gave her." "And the statues?" Min whispered. "They're made from the river's clay, the same river that drank her blood. Every 7 generations, the bride must be married again to a vessel of the betrayer's bloodline, or she will wake, and she will not be gentle." Min shook his head slowly. "This is madness." Yao met his eyes. "Do you dream of her yet?" That night Min did. He stood beneath a red canopy, smoke swirling around him. The villagers were chanting, faceless in the mist. Before him knelt the bride, veil draped like wet silk over her face. She lifted her hands. They were made of clay, but bleeding at the fingertips. When she reached out to him, her voice echoed without breath. "You left me beneath the river. Now I leave you no choice." He stumbled back, dropping it. It fell with a sound too loud for such a small object, like bone hitting stone. Behind him, the forest rustled. He turned, heart racing, and saw a woman in red just beyond the tree line. Still, silent, the same figure from last night. This time, she wasn't smiling. At dawn, Shui arrived. She was his cousin, a little younger, quiet, always trailing behind Min during those brief childhood visits. Her hair was shorter now, unevenly cut, her eyes darker than he remembered. "I saw her," she said simply, "the bride. She watches me in the mirror when I comb my hair." Min sat beside her on the porch. "She wants a name," she whispered, "but we're not supposed to know it." "Why not?" "Because to speak it is to bind yourself to her." A silence fell between them. Shui reached into her sleeve and pulled out something wrapped in black silk. She handed it to him without a word. It was the ledger, a thick, faded book of rice paper and blood seals. Inside were records of marriages, offerings, sacrifices, dates written in ash ink, names that no longer existed in census records, and a single line that chilled him to the bone. "If the bride wakes without the blood-bound groom, she will walk the village until the clay cracks and the gods remember her name." Min looked up, heart pounding. "Who wrote this?" Shui's voice was a whisper. "Your mother." The village awoke to chanting. Soft at first, just a murmur threading through the fog. But it grew louder as the sun refused to rise. Min stood at the window of the ancestral house, staring out into the pale morning. The sound came from the shrine, rhythmic and low, like lungs breathing through wood. A red thread had been tied across his door in the night, a warning or a ward. He stepped over it. Outside, the villagers were already gathering, their eyes glassy, robes red and white like funeral offerings. At the center of the square, beneath the faded canopy, the clay bride sat once more. The hairpin had been placed in her hand. Her fingers had curled around it, and someone had painted her lips blood red. Inside the shrine, the elders waited in a half circle around a blackened brazier. Ash clung to their robes like snow. Uncle Yao stood at the edge, arms crossed, face drawn tight with sleep deprivation and dread. The shaman, masked, silent, gestured to Min. "Your turn," Yao said. Min didn't move. "What is this?" "Your offering," said another elder, a woman with cloudy eyes and a voice like torn paper. "You are the last of your line. The pact requires blood." "I didn't agree to this." "It doesn't require your agreement, only your blood." The shaman stepped forward with a silver dagger, old, ceremonial, engraved with the symbol of Shen Ming, the spirit path. He held out a bowl etched with black script. "Just a drop," Yao said quietly, "to seal the silence." Men backed away. No. The silence broke like glass. The elders rose to their feet, their expressions turning from weary to frantic. The shaman hissed behind his mask. Wind roared through the shrine, extinguishing every candle at once. And the bride, her statue, cracked. From the chest outward, long fissures bloomed through her clay skin. One arm detached and fell with a dull thud, revealing what lay inside. Flesh, rotting, wet. Men stumbled back, gagging. "Gods," someone whispered, "she's waking too soon." "Rebind her," shouted another. "The clay girl was not mixed with blood. It's rejecting the seal." Men turned to leave, but the wind slammed the doors shut behind him. From the altar, the hairpin rolled toward him, stopped at his feet. And from behind the cracked veil of the bride's statue, something exhaled. They called it sacrilege. That night, Min became a pariah. No one would look him in the eye. Children were pulled away when he passed. Doors were shut too quickly. Offerings left on doorsteps were burned before the sun touched them. He wandered through the village alone, the fog now a permanent shroud. The trees whispered, the clay path darkened. At the edge of the forest, he saw the bride again. She stood barefoot in the riverbed, her red veil soaked with mud. This time, her hands were empty, her fingers twitching. Men turned to run, but her voice echoed through the trees. Not a scream, not a whisper, but something in between. "You were mine once. You will be again." Shui found him near the old fig tree, breathless and shaking. "She's growing stronger," Shui said, crouching beside him. "The refusal, it's unraveling everything." "It's not fair," Men snapped. "Why should it be I that pay? I didn't make the pact. I didn't curse her." "You carry the blood of the one who did," she whispered. "That's enough." Men stared at her. "And how do you know all of this?" Shui hesitated. Then she unbuttoned her sleeve and rolled it back. Her forearm was covered in script, inked in faded red, rows and rows of ancient glyphs. They pulsed faintly beneath the skin. "She came to me first," Shui said, "years ago, in dreams. She taught me the rites, said I was the wrong blood, but that I would remember for the one who was right." Men's voice caught. "And what did she want?" Shui's eyes were empty. "A wedding and justice." That evening, the village bells rang. The villagers gathered without invitation. This time, the groom statue had been removed. Only the bride remained, her cracked frame partially mended with new clay. But the veil was gone, and where her face should have been was a mirror. Not glass, polished metal, blackened around the edges. One by one, the villagers were made to approach and look. Some collapsed, others wept. A few stood motionless, eyes wide open. When Min's turn came, he resisted, but the elders blocked his path. The mirror reflected nothing at first. Then slowly, an image formed. Not the bride, himself, wearing red, hands tied with string, a wedding ribbon around his throat like a noose. He stumbled back. In the reflection, he saw the bride smile. Back at the ancestral house, the lights would not stay lit. Min lit candle after candle, but each sputtered out within minutes. The rooms grew cold. The urn on the altar cracked again, hairline fractures forming spiderwebs along the ceramic surface. He tried to call the city. No signal. Tried to leave the house. The fog thickened into walls. The village had become a maze of shadows. At midnight, someone knocked on the door. Not once, 3 times. He opened it slowly. No one stood there. Only a bundle of red thread, soaked in blood and tied in the shape of a bridal knot. He burned the thread, threw the hairpin into the old well, tried to sleep, but the dreams returned. This time he stood in the shrine. The bride sat across from him, her face revealed but hollow. No eyes, no skin, only clay, cracked and weeping. Her hands held something, his heart, still beating. He awoke, screaming. The pillow beneath his head was wet with mud. By morning, things were worse. Shui was missing. The villagers were silent. Only Yao met his eyes, barely. "She refused the rites," Yao said. "Now the bride is looking for another vessel." Min's voice broke. "What do I do?" "Give the offering," Yao said, "before she finds one herself." But it was too late. That evening, they found Shui in her room, eyes wide open, mouth sewn to shut with red thread, her hands folded in the bridal mudra, the same position the bride had held the hairpin. Her body was cold, but her lips were smiling. Shui's body was laid out in the ancestral hall beneath a shroud of red silk. Her face, serene beneath the thread, bore no signs of struggle, only stillness. Her hands remained folded, fingers locked in the bridal mudra, thumb and ring finger touching, the others outstretched like the petals of a lotus. Min sat motionless across from her, the silence pressing in around him like wet earth. The elders had begun preparations for a cleansing rite, but their movements were stiff with dread. No one spoke of the bride. No one asked why a living girl had taken the posture of a clay effigy. No one dared to admit what they all knew. She had been chosen. Uncle Yao placed a cup of bitter tea in front of Min, the surface swirling with bits of ash. "She died with the mark," Yao said quietly. "That means the bride has made her first step into this world." Min's voice was raw. "You said she only wanted a wedding." "She does, but if the pact is broken, she doesn't wait." Min turned to the old man, frustration rising. "Why didn't you stop this? Why didn't any of you stop her from taking Jue?" Yao looked away, ashamed. "Because we've never been able to stop her. We only delay, one generation at a time." Min stared down at the tea. "And how many more must die before it ends?" Yao's answer was barely a whisper. "Just you." The cleansing ritual began at dusk. Min was made to kneel before the altar where Jue's body lay. He was handed a strand of red thread and told to wind it around his fingers without breaking it, 12 turns for each ancestral soul. Behind him, the elders chanted in low, gravelly tones. The shaman moved in circles around him, sprinkling powdered bone across the floor, marking out a protective seal. As the smoke thickened, Min felt something stir in his stomach. A memory. No, not a memory, a sensation. A firelight, screaming, a woman's voice crying out beneath the surface of water. He gasped and nearly broke the thread. The chanting stopped. The shaman leaned forward and whispered, "She is watching. Be still." Min glanced to the doorway. There, in the courtyard beyond the shrine, stood a clay figure. It wore red, and it was missing its veil. That night he couldn't stay in the house. The air inside tasted of rot and clay, as if the bride had begun to seep through the walls. The floors creaked even when no one walked. The altar candles wouldn't stay lit. He wandered the village, past shuttered windows and closed doors. Everyone was hiding now, not from men, but from her. At the edge of the square, he stopped. The bride's statue, the one meant for the wedding, had moved again. It now stood upright, arms lowered to its sides, as if waiting to be led down the aisle. Min approached it cautiously. A gust of wind lifted the edge of its veil. He glimpsed the faintest outline of eyes behind the clay. Open, alive. He ran. Through the trees, past the old well, past the fig tree where the bride first appeared. His breath came in broken gasps, feet slipping on old wet moss and old roots. He didn't stop until he reached the old Taoist hall, now a ruin of splintered beams and sagging roof tiles. But within its broken bones, the scrolls still hung, weather-worn, tattered by time, but sacred. Min stepped into the ruin, his hands trembling. At the center lay an altar stone cracked in half, and beneath it a hidden compartment locked with twine. He untied it. Inside were 3 objects: a journal bound in blackened leather, a needle made of bone and dipped in cinnabar, and a piece of human hair braided with red thread. He opened the journal and read the first page. To bind a spirit, you must first know her grief. The journal was written in the hand of a Taoist priest, perhaps the last one who had dared to face the bride. Page after page detailed rituals, names, signs of possession, but one passage had been marked with blood. The woman's soul will bind to the object of greatest betrayal. In this case, the hairpin. Her rage cannot be exorcised, only wed. The clay must be mixed with blood, or her form will reject it. She seeks the betrayer's heir. She seeks the one who remembers. Min's hand shook. Below the passage, someone had scrawled. She sees through mirrors. She moves through thread. Once she weaves her name into your bones, you belong to her. A sound broke the stillness, a rustling behind him. He turned. The door creaked open slowly, revealing nothing, until he looked down. Footprints, fresh, wet, pressed into the dirt and leading inside. They stopped in front of him, then reversed, as if something had just been standing there, watching, and now slipped away. He ran. Back at the ancestral house, he found the thread. Dozens of strands of red thread, woven through his bed frame, tied around the nails in the wall, wrapped tight around the altar candles, which had been snuffed out. In the center of the room, arranged with unnatural precision, sat the bone needle he had taken from the ruins. It had returned to him. And on the pillow, written in ash, was a single word in ancient script. Yue. A name. The name he wasn't supposed to know. The bride's name. He screamed and threw the needle across the room, but as it hit the wall, the house groaned. The beams above him creaked and split, and from the ceiling, something fell. He staggered back as a clump of wet clay hit the floor with a sickening squelch, and then another, and another, until a shape began to form. A figure, kneeling, hands folded, veil lowered. Yue.
The figure on the floor didn't breathe, yet men could feel her presence swell in the room, heavy and wet, like something dredged up from the bottom of a river and laid bare before the living. The clay that dripped from her skin pulsed with heat, but the room was ice cold. Her veil lay in folds across her shoulders now, half cracked, soaked through with thick black mud. Min stood frozen. The bride knelt before him, head bowed, hands folded, the posture of obedience or patience. Then she raised her head. Clay sloughed off her cheek like shedding skin, revealing glimpses of something beneath, not flesh, not bone, but something older. Her eye opened, just one, the socket wet with river muck and brimming with recognition. She knew him, not as a stranger, but as someone who had once promised her something and never returned. Min staggered backward, heart hammering against his ribs. He reached for the door, yanked it open, and ran into the fog. The trees were black outlines now, slanting toward him like teeth. Every path lit in a circle. Every sound behind him made him flinch, and all he could hear was the squelch, squelch, squelch of bare clay feet following. He didn't stop running until he reached the old well. It had long been dry, overgrown with moss and sealed with a ring of protective charms, now brittle, now broken. He fell to his knees, breathing hard, and saw the hairpin again. It had returned, laid neatly on the well's edge, clean and dry, as if untouched by centuries of curse or soil. His hand shook as he picked it up. It pulsed in his palm like a heartbeat. By sunrise, Min had barricaded himself inside the ancestral shrine. He drew the bone needle from his coat, lit a single candle, and opened the Taoist journal again. The ink inside had begun to smear, as if reacting to his touch. One passage stood out now, glowing faintly beneath the flicker of flame. If she is awakening in flesh before the wedding rite, the vessel must be prepared or consumed.
Min muttered the line again and again. Prepared or consumed. He looked to the corner, where the villagers had set up the clay groom statue the week prior. But the groom had collapsed, shattered, as if something had crushed it from within. Only a pile of clay and broken teeth remained. The next evening the village bell rang, not the bronze one by the hall, not the wooden clapper used during mourning. This was the bride's bell, carved in stone, painted red, and rung only when the spirit began to walk among them. Every home shut its doors, incense was lit, bowls of sticky rice and bitter herbs were placed outside thresholds, mirrors were covered, no one dared speak her name. Min wandered the square alone. At the center, beneath the tattered canopy, she stood, not a statue, not an effigy. Yue. Her red wedding robe hung in tatters, her hair, long and streaked with mud, clung to her neck in damp braids. Her eyes glowed faintly in the gloom, not human, not beast, but something in between. She did not look at him. She looked beyond him, as though waiting for a procession that had not yet arrived. He fled to Yao's house, banged on the door until his knuckles bled. When Yao opened it, he said nothing, only stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. Inside, the smell of old herbs and burnt offerings filled the air. Min threw the hairpin on the table. "She's awake," he said. The statue moved, then she moved. I saw her. She stood beneath the canopy. She's waiting for something, for me. Yao's face was hollow. "She's crossing," he said. "Not just in dreams, not just in clay, in flesh." Min's voice cracked. "How do I stop her?" Yao looked at him for a long time and finally said, "You can't." That night, Ye came again. Min woke to find his room filled with wet footprints, clay tracks that circled his bed again and again, smearing across the wood in a spiral pattern. The windows were closed, the door had not been opened, and yet the hairpin now rested on his chest once more, tied with a red thread, attached to his wrist. He tried to untie it. The thread cut into his skin, tighter. He grabbed a knife and severed it. The thread bled, and so did he. He wandered the village with a bandaged hand, passing homes that now sat like tombs. The fog never lifted, the sun refused to show, as if time had paused, waiting for something ancient to finish weeping. Children were gone. Dogs would not bark. At the riverbed he saw the elders digging again, not with shovels, but with their bare hands, pulling up bones from the clay. They placed them into red lacquered boxes, sealed with wax, and buried them beneath household thresholds. Protective ancestors, Yao later explained, but none of the bones bore names. They had been forgotten. At the shrine, the groom statue was gone, removed, replaced with a mirror, the same obsidian mirror Yue had worn on her face in the vision. Now it sat on a pedestal beside her effigy, reflecting nothing but flickering shadows and a faint red light, like a sun that only shone beneath the earth. Men approached it slowly. Inside the mirror, he saw a hallway, familiar, wooden floors, red lanterns, his childhood home in the city. And at the end of the hallway, a figure in red, standing completely still, waiting. Men backed away. The mirror cracked. A single spiderweb fracture at its center, and from it, a drop of mud leaked onto the altar stone. Yao found him trembling. "She's found her way through," he whispered. "She knows where I live. I saw it." "She doesn't need your house," Yao said grimly. "She only needs your name." In the days that followed, the villagers stopped speaking entirely. They moved like shadows, setting up the final rituals in silence. Red banners were stitched, paper offerings burned. The shaman prepared the bridal robes and a new mask for Min. The wedding was coming, but the groom had not been chosen, because the groom had already been marked, Min, by blood, by thread, by memory. He sat alone under the fig tree, hairpin in hand. The fog swirled like a veil around him, and he whispered for the first time, "Yue." The tree groaned, its bark split, and from the hollow, the bride stepped out. No veil, no robes, just her eyes, eyes that saw centuries through him, eyes that knew exactly who he had once been, and still chose him again.
The air in Yunxi turned still. Even the fog had quieted, pressing low like a wet sheet pulled over a corpse. No wind, no birds, no breath. Min sat inside the ruins of the Taoist hall, the hairpin resting in front of him like a coiled serpent. It no longer burned. It no longer whispered. It only waited. He'd said her name. He'd called her. Now she waited for him to remember. He found Yao sitting in the back room of the ancestral house, writing with fingers stained in ink and dried blood. Dozens of scrolls lay open across the floor, their calligraphy smeared, symbols drawn hastily, protection spells, sealing diagrams, fragments of old Taoist rites. Yao didn't look up. "She's chosen you," he said softly. "I know. She will come to you in 3 forms: bride, widow, and flame." I frowned. What does that mean? The bride seeks to finish the ritual. The widow mourns the first betrayal. And the flame? The flame burns through the veil. I lowered myself to the floor, facing my uncle. "Tell me the truth, everything." He exhaled, long and slow, and began. "There was a Taoist once, a master of spirit binding known across 7 provinces. He lived in seclusion, raising his daughter alone after his wife died giving birth. She was beautiful, quiet, gifted with second sight. She spoke to spirits? She silenced them, with words her father taught her, with incense and will. Her name was Yue." I looked down at the hairpin. Its red threads were tighter today, knotted. Yao continued. "The warlord from the south heard of her, not her beauty, her power. He believed if he could bind her soul to his estate, it would never fall, that no enemy could take it from him. He came to the village and offered to marry her. The father refused. My throat tightened. So he killed her? No, not yet. He returned later, with fire, with soldiers. They slaughtered the household, took Yue. She bit off her own tongue before they could take her voice. But it was too late. The warlord forced the wedding, bound her corpse to his through Taoist mockery, tying her soul to a clay vessel using her mother's hairpin. And when the priest arrived, she was already buried beneath the estate." I closed my eyes. The father cursed the land. Yao nodded. He swore vengeance, not by revenge, but by memory, that each generation would remember the bride and carry her until justice returned. Justice? Until the blood of the betrayer was wed to her, willingly. I stood at the edge of the riverbed, staring down at the cracked soil where the village had dug clay for centuries. Now it smelled of iron, the kind of scent that soaked into clothes and skin. I stepped barefoot into the basin.
Each footfall sank slightly. The mud gave way too easily, as if it wanted him. And from somewhere beneath, drums began to sound. Not real, memory. I could see it now, the first wedding, a hilltop estate, a bride in red with no breath, a priest with his mouth sewn shut, a warlord laughing as the hairpin was placed into Yue's palm. And nearby, a boy, a page, watching. That boy had his face. He returned to the shrine with the clay still clinging to his legs. The villagers had begun setting up the red canopy again, but now it was done with grim resolve. They weren't preparing for celebration. They were building a cage. I stood at the altar where Yue's statue had once been. Now, in its place, was a mirror and a candle. I lit the candle. The mirror flickered. Yue appeared. No veil, no robe, only sorrow. Only eyes that remembered fire and silence and centuries of waiting. And when she spoke, the mirror cracked. You knew me once. You left me in the clay. Now, marry me in ash. That night, I made my decision. I went to the old shrine where Shui's body had been laid and knelt before her empty platform. In his hand was the bone needle. Around his wrist, a new red thread. He stabbed the needle into his palm. Blood flowed freely. He smeared it across the altar stones. He placed the hairpin at the center, and he spoke her name aloud. Not whispered, not feared. He claimed it. Yue. The wind howled. Every lantern in the village shattered at once, and the bride stepped from the shadows behind him, real, not clay, her face no longer cracked, her mouth no longer smiling, only watching and waiting. The final rite began at dawn. The villagers, silent, dressed him in ceremonial red. The robes were heavy. The mask was porcelain, shaped in the image of the old warlord, an insult, but a necessity. The only way to bind her completely was to confront her in his form. Men walked barefoot down the clay path toward the shrine. Yue waited beneath the canopy, no longer in robes, no longer in need of them. She was flesh now. Her eyes reflected candlelight. Her feet left muddy prints with every step. As Min approached, she tilted her head and whispered, "Do you come willingly?" I paused, then nodded. Yes. They knelt opposite each other. In place of vows, they burned strands of red thread. In place of incense, they lit dried bones from the riverbed. In place of rings, I placed the hairpin into her palm, and she closed her fingers around it without breaking eye contact. The shaman said nothing. The villagers wept in silence. It was done. The pact was sealed. But Yue did not smile. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to mine, and she said something only I could hear. You remember the fire. I looked at her, and then I staggered backward. Memories crashed over me. I was the page boy. I had served the warlord. I had watched the fire from the hill, and when the father came screaming through the smoke, I had closed the gates. I hadn't been innocent. I'd been part of it. The betrayal, the silence, the sealing. This was my second life, and now she would claim it, not with rage, but with completion. The village awoke to the sound of chains, not the clang of metal, but the soft, deliberate drag of something old and ceremonial. Links crafted not of iron,
but of twisted reeds, bone fragments, and knotted red thread. They stretched across the square like veins, looping from home to home, shrine to shrine, sealing doors and marking thresholds. It was the beginning of the Festival of Chains, a ritual only held when a pact was near breaking or nearly fulfilled. Men watched from the balcony of the ancestral house as the villagers worked in silence, wrapping charms around posts, hanging burned prayer scrolls soaked in ox blood. No music played, no lanterns danced, only fireless braziers, casting no shadows. And in the center of the square, beneath the canopy as before, Yue stood, still, watching. Her eyes now bore embers where once there was clay. By noon, the village had transformed into a waiting tomb. Even the wind moved differently, circling rather than passing through. Time slowed, incense smoke hung mid-air. Children, if they were still present, no longer cried. Yao sat with Min in the shadow of the shrine. "She remembers everything," Yao said, tracing a Taoist sigil into the dirt with a trembling finger. "But so do you now." Min nodded. It was no longer just dreams. He'd relived it all in pieces, his past self, his part in the betrayal. Not the warlord, no, but the boy who watched and did nothing, who turned away when you screamed. "I was a coward," Min said softly. "No," Yao corrected. "You were complicit." That word landed like a stone. At dusk, the shaman began the procession. Not a joyous wedding parade, but a funeral march in reverse. Villagers moved through the streets barefoot, their mouths sewn shut with ceremonial threads to prevent the bride from hearing their prayers. They carried offerings wrapped in wet cloth, toad bones, cracked bells, and jars of river water long since evaporated. Min was given a lantern, but it wasn't lit. "You are the vessel," the shaman said, behind his blackened mask. "You must walk in darkness. She will light the path." So Min stepped into the square alone, the cold lantern in his hands, and Yu waiting at the far end. The walk felt endless. Each step echoed, not on stone, not on wood, but on mud, moist, growing wetter, as if the village itself was beginning to bleed through the soles of his feet. By the time he reached her, his toes were black with clay. Yu tilted her head. The candle within her eyes flickered, and then, without a word, the lantern in his hands caught fire. No spark, no heat, just flame, ghostly blue, eating the air. The villagers dropped to their knees. The canopy above began to unravel, its red threads floating upward as if taken by an invisible wind. The chains around the village tightened, pulled by no hands, groaning against each other as if resisting something vast. And Yu lifted her arms, for the first time, not in worship, not in supplication, but in invitation. Min stepped forward, and the square began to shake. Cracks split the earth beneath the altar. The well at the edge of the village groaned and bubbled with black liquid. From the ancestral hall, the mirror shattered inward, scattering obsidian shards across the floor like teeth. And through it all, the villagers began to chant, no longer wordless, no longer afraid, but in a tongue older than the village itself. Men didn't understand the words, but Yu did. She turned toward the sound, and her body, once stiff and spectral, began to burn. Not with fire, but with memory. Her robes ignited into strands of smoke. Her fingers shed their clay, revealing skin underneath. Old, dead, but real. She stepped down from the platform, walked past men, and stopped at the foot of the well. There, the villagers placed the final object, a bowl, white porcelain, cracked, and inside it, a fragment of her tongue, severed, preserved in ash. She lifted it gently, and as she did, the chanting stopped. The silence returned like a storm, and the well began to speak, not in words, not in sound, but in breath. Thick, warm air rose from its depths, laced with the scent of decay and jasmine. And then, a figure emerged. Not you, but a groom. Not the clay statue, but something else. Its face was blurred, ever-changing, sometimes Min's face, sometimes the warlord's, sometimes the boy he used to be. It reached out, and you refused. She turned away, and the chains across the village snapped. Pandemonium erupted. Doors blew open, shrines burst into flame. The villager screamed, not with terror, but with ecstasy, as if possessed by the same memory that now gripped the bride. Yu spun toward men, her hands dripping with the ink from the bowl. She pressed her fingers to his face, one stroke, then another, marking him with the sigil of union, and whispered, "This time, I choose." The ground beneath the shrine split open, the past tore through the present, and Min, still holding the lantern, now burning brighter than ever before, was pulled downward, into the riverbed, into the clay, into her story. The world was no longer real. Min opened his eyes and found himself underground, but not buried. He stood within a corridor carved of wet clay, walls pulsing faintly as though alive. Flickers of light, like breath made visible, seeped through cracks in the ceiling, illuminating faded murals painted across the earthen walls. Scenes from lives not his own. A woman kneeling in red, a man towering over her with a blade hidden behind his back, a house on fire, a girl with her tongue bitten off, and beside her, a child no older than 10, watching through a crack in the wall. That child bore Min's face. He stepped deeper into the corridor. Every footfall echoed with water, though the ground was dry. The further he walked, the more vivid the murals became, now rising off the walls like sculptures, clay figures reaching from the dirt with outstretched arms, begging not for help, but for witness. At the corridor's end stood a door of bone, rib cages bent and tied with red thread into the shape of an arch. On it was carved a single word, "Remember." Min reached for the thread, and the door opened inward. He was back in the warlord's manor. But not truly. This was the first Yunsi, before the village became a grave. Stone buildings, incense floating in the air, servants with black veils, soldiers drinking rice wine as musicians played fractured melodies, and there in the center court, a wedding. The groom stood tall, face hidden beneath a mask of silver. The bride was silent. She did not walk. She was carried, pale and limp, her hands folded and tied with string. Her lips moved, but no words came. Her eyes, though open, were empty. Yune, alive and already dead. Min wandered through the courtyard unseen, a phantom among phantoms. No one noticed him. The servants bowed. The priest raised his book. And then Min saw himself, or rather, the boy he had once been, holding a bowl of offerings, standing beside the warlord's seat, watching, not crying, not stopping it, just watching. Min moved closer. He wanted to scream, to grab the child by the shoulders and say, "You can stop this!" But the child turned and looked directly at him and whispered, "It was easier to forget." The scene shattered. Clay crumbled. Min found himself in a small room, tight walls, straw mat on the floor, a single window boarded shut. A woman lay in the corner, Yune, real-time, breathing shallowly. She wore no veil. Her robes were soaked in blood and dirt. Her mouth moved wordlessly, lips trembling as if trying to speak through pain alone. A man entered, not the warlord, Uncle Yao, younger, thinner, carrying a brush and a bowl of ash. He knelt beside her and began to paint her skin with sigils, one by one, binding spells designed not to heal, but to preserve. Min gasped. Yao had been there. He had helped seal her. The vision collapsed again. This time, Min stood in the ancestral shrine, but older, darker, surrounded by people in mourning. At the center was a coffin. Inside, the hairpin. Nothing else. No body, just the object that held the soul. And standing before it were 7 men. Each bore a seal upon their brow, the same family, the same bloodline. His ancestors. They placed their palms to the lid of the coffin, one after another, and swore, "Let the clay contain her. Let the bride forget. Let the future never know our sin." Min fell to his knees. The curse had not been born from Yune's wrath. It had been crafted by the betrayers. He was yanked from the vision by cold hands. Yune stood before him, not angry, not weeping, but hollow, as if she had given up on being understood. She led him wordlessly to a room beneath the earth, lit by candles that burned without heat. Inside, hundreds of dolls, all made of clay, each bearing a resemblance to a different generation of villagers. At the far wall, 3 statues sat at an altar. One was Yune, one was the warlord, and the third was Min. Not a doll, a statue of himself, smiling, hands bound in the mudra of marriage. Yune reached out and touched the statue's cheek. Then she whispered, "I waited for you to remember, not for revenge, but for truth." Min's voice shook. "What truth?" Yune stepped closer, her face now crumbling again, clay shedding like bark from an old tree. "That you chose silence once, and silence is betrayal." The chamber trembled. Above them, the village shook. The ground cracked open. Red light poured through the soil. Yune turned her back on him and began to walk into the fire, her body returning to ash with each step. Min reached out. "No, wait!" She didn't turn. "Then choose me now, or I will forget myself and burn everything with me." The house no longer felt like shelter. Every board creaked as though bearing witness. Every corner of shadow whispered of things once buried. Min returned to his mother's ancestral home with a heavy silence in his chest. He had seen the betrayal, the binding, the curse not as punishment, but as preservation. Preserving silence, preserving shame. His ancestors hadn't just made a mistake, they'd chosen to bury her,
literally and metaphorically, and teach the next generations to forget. He had remembered. And now the past demanded more. Yao sat by the altar, sifting through the ashes of burnt offerings. His eyes were red, his hands trembling from exhaustion or guilt, or both. Min dropped the hairpin in front of him. "I saw it," Min said. Yao didn't ask what. Min continued, voice low and cold. "You were there when they sealed her. You painted her skin. You didn't stop them." Yao closed his eyes. "I was a boy. They said it was mercy. No, it was control." Silence. Then Yao whispered, "She's beneath this house." They found the trap door under the altar, old, circular, covered in layers of soot and ritual cloth. It groaned when they opened it, revealing a spiral staircase carved straight into the clay itself. The walls wept moisture as they descended, the air becoming thick, humid, but still, like a tomb. The deeper they went, the more the carvings changed. What began as symbols of protection slowly warped into symbols of containment. This was not a shrine. It was a prison. At the bottom, the room opened into a chamber lit only by the faint phosphorescence of mold along the walls. Roots hung from the ceiling like veins, twitching faintly. At the center lay a figure. She was not clay, nor entirely human. Her body was folded in on itself, limbs bent in the traditional kneeling posture of a Taoist wedding rite. Her red robe had long since fused into her skin. Her hair, long, dark, matted with centuries of decay, spread across the floor like spilled ink. And embedded in her chest was the original hairpin. Its thread was black with time, its tip still sharp. Min stepped forward, and the moment his foot touched the ground, her eyes opened. Not with aggression, not even with sorrow, but with expectation. She knew he had come. Her mouth moved, but made no sound. Centuries ago, she had bitten off her tongue, but now she didn't need words. She raised a hand, slow, trembling, and pointed behind him. Min turned. There, against the far wall, hung the first effigy, the original clay statue used to contain her soul after death. It was fractured, weathered, but unmistakable. It bore his childhood face. Yao approached slowly, hands open. "She's not whole," he murmured. "Her body lies here, but her spirit is scattered. Some of her is in the hairpin, some in the clay, some in the bloodline." Min felt the truth bloom inside him. "She needs all parts reunited to finally rest," he whispered. Yao nodded. "But the last part is the vessel." Min turned to her, but she was standing. She didn't walk. She floated just inches above the ground, her limbs barely moving, her eyes locked on his. Her presence filled the chamber like rising water, and yet men did not step back. He met her gaze and saw not vengeance, but longing, not love, but completion. He whispered, "You want to return, but not to live." She blinked slowly. He understood. She didn't want revenge anymore. She just wanted the wedding to end, to be released, to sleep at last. He reached forward. His fingers found the edge of the hairpin in her chest. The metal pulsed faintly. And as he pulled it free,
Her form began to unravel, not in agony, but in relief. She sank slowly to the floor, her body shedding clay in wisps, revealing flashes of her young face beneath the hardened layers. Tears streamed from her eyes, clear, human. The first and last tears she would ever shed in this world. Min turned to the effigy. He drove the hairpin into its chest. Clay cracked. The statue opened from within like a hollow shell. And inside was his own reflection, tied in red, mouth sewn shut. He reached out, touched it, and the chamber collapsed. Flashes, drums, lanterns. The wedding never completed, the silence never broken, the ritual now rewritten. He saw it all at once. He saw Yeo walking in the city, barefoot on pavement, following bloodlines. He saw girls in red veils dreaming of mud. He saw the river swell once more. And then he saw darkness. And in that darkness, only her voice. You have remembered. Now I will forget.
Min stood at the threshold of the shrine, dressed in red. The robe clung to his skin like damp fog, heavy with ceremonial thread and the scent of crushed sandalwood. The sleeves were stitched with ancestral sigils, some protective, some binding. The mask in his hand was smooth porcelain, painted with the face of a stranger. Sharp jawline, narrow lips, hollow black eyes. The face of the warlord, his past self, his punishment. Tonight the marriage rite would begin, not as performance, not as symbolic closure, but as the final act of a curse that had lingered for centuries. The villagers moved like wraiths. They did not speak, they did not look directly at him, but they obeyed the ritual. Each offered something old, things once buried, forgotten or feared. A lock of hair tied with infant ribbon, a cracked bridal mirror from a drowned wife, a paper doll soaked in blood. These were offerings of memory, placed at the feet of the altar like petals before execution. Yu stood beneath the canopy, not moving, not breathing. Her hair was no longer matted, but arranged with elegant precision, wrapped in a style lost to time, secured with a single pin. The same hairpin Min had pulled from her heart. The shaman emerged from the smoke with slow, deliberate steps. His mask was cracked, his robes torn, but he carried the ancient scroll of binding in both hands. He said nothing. There were no words left that hadn't already been spoken in dreams, in screams, in centuries of silence. He merely unrolled the scroll and nodded. The rite had begun. Min stepped forward. His bare feet touched the threshold of the shrine. The ground was no longer wood, but clay, soft and warm beneath him, as if he stood not on earth, but on memory. With each step toward the bride, he saw glimpses of the past flicker in the corners of the shrine. Yu kneeling before her father, the warlord's men breaking down the door, the wedding held in blood. Each vision passed through him like smoke. He reached the altar. Yu lifted her eyes. Her gaze pierced him. She saw not the man he was, but the soul he had carried. The coward, the betrayer, the vessel. She raised her hand, not to strike, not to curse, but to offer her wrist. Min took the red thread from the shaman's bowl and bound their wrists together. 7 loops, one for each generation since her death. On the 7th, the thread turned black in his hands. You blinked once and whispered, "Do you choose me now?" Min swallowed hard and said, "Yes." The candle flames around them turned blue. The shrine trembled. From the rafters, the protective talismans began to curl and fall. The villagers outside began to chant, not in fear, but in release. The ritual was consuming the final barriers, one by one. And then the shaman stepped forward with the final object, a mirror wrapped in red silk. He placed it before them. Men looked down. The mirror reflected only you. She, in turn, looked into it and began to burn. Her skin did not blacken, it glowed. Her eyes lit like twin lanterns. Her hair lifted strand by strand as if caught in invisible wind. And then her mouth opened, not to scream, but to speak. For the first time in centuries, her voice returned. "I was not meant to be your bride. I was meant to be your end." The red thread snapped. The mask fell from Min's face and shattered. He staggered back, but the mirror held him, reflected him as he truly was. Not men, but all the men who had borne her silence. All the bloodlines that had twisted her memory. She stepped forward and touched his chest. "Give it." Pain blossomed in him, not physical but spiritual, like hands reaching into his soul, pulling free the guilt he had never voiced. He saw himself as a boy again, turning away, letting the fire consume her house, letting the gate close. He had been a page, a witness, a coward, and now he was the sacrifice. He dropped to his knees. She leaned down and placed the hairpin in his mouth, the way brides of old sealed their last breath. And then she kissed his forehead, and the shrine exploded with light.
Min awoke in a world without color. The shrine was gone. The village gone. The stars above him were motionless, cold. He stood on a road made of ash, stretching into a horizon that never ended. The ground pulsed with every breath he took, as though the world itself was alive and waiting. He was no longer wearing red, only white. Plain cloth, the color of mourning. Ahead, the path curved into a shape he recognized, the infinity loop drawn into Taoist shrines to bind spirits during exorcisms. He was no longer in the land of the living. He was walking through memory's prism. The first echo greeted him with silence. It appeared not as sound, but as sensation, weightless and suffocating all at once. To his left, he saw Yue as a child, sitting beneath the fig tree that once grew at the village's edge. Her hands cradled a sparrow with a broken wing. She whispered to it in a dialect lost to time, trying to coax it back to life. Behind her, soldiers marched. Min turned, heart pounding. The scene froze, then burned away. The second echo arrived like wind. This time, the warlord's manor, intact, glorious, adorned in banners of gold. And there stood Yue, dressed for the wedding, her arms bound, her face void of emotion. Min watched as the priest lifted a scroll and began to chant, binding words twisted into cruelty. The warlord smiled behind his mask. And in the corner, a child again, himself, watching, not stopping it, just watching.
Men stepped toward the boy, but the ground fell away, and he dropped through darkness. He landed hard in a reflection of the ancestral shrine, but warped. The walls wept red. The mirrors were made of clay. In every mirror, he saw not his face, but Yue's. In one, she was screaming. In another, she was silent. In the last, she smiled and whispered, "You chose me." Min reached out, touched the mirror. It shattered, and from the shards, the real Yue stepped forward. But her eyes were no longer hers. They belonged to him. "You bound me," she said, not in anger, but clarity. "You watched. You forgot. You inherited. But still, you didn't choose." Min shook his head. "I did. I chose you. I said yes. I tied the thread." "No," she interrupted. "You tied the thread to end your guilt, not to free me." She raised a hand, and the world around them responded. Clay rising like a tide, mirrors groaning, ancestral names burning into the walls. "You want to be forgiven, but you never once said you were sorry." Min fell to his knees. He felt the weight of it now. Not the curse, but the choice. Generations of silence, of complicity, of burying the truth and painting it over with sacred rites, of building a village on top of her grave. And when the hairpin was passed down, they called it an heirloom, not a tomb. He began to cry. And for the first time in any echo, she listened. "I am sorry," he whispered. "I was afraid. I was weak. And I wanted it to be someone else's responsibility. I buried you to bury myself. I used your memory as a wall instead of a window. I am sorry." She kent before him. For a moment the world softened. The clay stopped rising. The air grew warm. She reached up and took off her veil. For the first time, he saw her full face. Beautiful. Not ethereal, not ghostly, just human. Tired. Eyes that had waited too long for release. She reached out and placed the hairpin in his hand. "You still must choose," she said. "There is a final vow. The spirit must be bound to the vessel fully, or be released into the earth forever. If you do not bind me now, I will return to clay, and I will take the village with me." Min looked down at the hairpin. It was no longer sharp. It was melting, becoming part of him even before the choice was made. And he knew. He could bind her or bury her. He stood, walked to the center of the shrine, drew a circle in the dirt with his palm. Yue followed. She knelt inside the circle, eyes closed. Min raised the hairpin and placed it against her throat. But instead of piercing her skin, he let it fall. It landed with a soft chime and dissolved. "I free you," he said. "Not for me, not for the village, not for our ancestors, but for you. You deserve a name that isn't bound to clay." The world shattered around them, not with destruction, but with release. Lanterns blew out, chains turned to smoke, and the shrine fell away into light. Yue stood, and, for the first and only time, smiled. The shrine was gone. The clay dissolved, and the veil of generations lifted like morning mist after a storm. Min stood alone in the square, barefoot on damp earth. The sky above Yangtze was gray, but no longer dead. The silence was softer now, less like fear, more like reverence. Still, the villagers did not emerge. They knew something had ended, or perhaps something had finally begun. The wind stirred the red canopy, now torn and half sunken into the soil, and beneath it a shallow hollow remained, like the outline of a body once resting there. Yue was gone, but the choice had not been without consequence. The ritual had been broken, and now the land was waking. Min returned to the riverbed where the clay was always taken. It was no longer cracked. It pulsed with moisture. The earth here was alive, breathing in slow, heavy rhythms. A mist curled low to the ground, swirling with ash. He stepped into it and knelt. His hand sank into the mud easily, too easily. He whispered, "I gave you back your name, but I haven't given enough." Behind him, the shrine bell rang once, not from the temple, but from beneath the earth, and in response, the clay under his fingers began to stir. From it, a face emerged, not Yue, but a boy's, his own, carved in river mud, weeping red from the eyes. He gasped and stepped back as more faces surfaced, generations of bloodline, silent, unforgiven, forgotten. Each one opened its mouth, and from their throats came the same name, spoken in a breathless unison. Yue, Yue, Yue. The air split with a sound like cracking bone. The well in the village center, sealed for decades, began to bleed. Not water, but red thread. It flowed over the edge like liquid silk, twisting through the square, reaching every doorstep, slipping under doors like seeking fingers. The village groaned. The bride had not returned, but her absence had opened the wound. The curse, without a vessel, was detaching from her. It now needed a home. Min ran to Yao's house. The old man sat slumped in his chair, silent, eyes open but distant. He had seen it too. "The curse is loose," Min said. "She was never the curse." Yao didn't blink. "It was us," he whispered. "We are the curse. We held her. We shaped her. We named her the monster so we could remain the victims." Min knelt before him. "She's gone." "No," Yao murmured. "She's waiting." "Where?" Yao lifted a trembling hand and pointed to Min's chest. "There." The red thread reached him that night. It wound through the floorboards and coiled around his bedposts. When he awoke, he was already marked. Symbols inked across his chest, binding marks, wedding seals, reversed talismans. Each one pulsing, each one whispering, "One must stay. The blood must repay what it once silenced." Min stood before the altar with the hairpin once more in hand, but this time he was alone. No bride, no shaman, no villagers. Only the spirit of the land and the weight of inheritance. He looked down at the pin. It no longer gleamed. It was dull, old, weary, like the curse itself. It did not demand revenge. It only demanded a final offering, something real, something living. He placed the hairpin on the altar, took the bone needle, and carved the name Yue into his palm. Not on paper, not in clay, but into himself. He pressed his hand to the altar stone and whispered, "Let it end with me." The altar split. The red thread recoiled like a dying snake, and from the earth below a soft hum rose, a sound like lullabies from another century. The village exhaled. The clay hardened. The bell stopped ringing. The wound closed. When morning came, the sky was clear.
No fog, no chains, no chanting. Only wind moving freely through branches that hadn't rustled in years. Min stood at the edge of the well. The red thread was gone. The mud was dry. And beside him, the villagers gathered, silent, hesitant. They didn't thank him. They simply wept. That night he dreamed of Yue one final time. She stood in a field of tall grass, hair loose, robes white, untouched by soil. She did not speak. She only nodded and walked into the mist, vanishing as softly as she had come.
The village of Yuanxi no longer whispered. It breathed. The air was no longer heavy with dread, but with something else. Grief unchained. Like smoke after rain. Like a long-held breath finally released. Min walked through the quiet streets barefoot, robes loosened, the hairpin gone. Children had begun to appear again, cautiously peeking through doorways. Elders sat outside, wordless, blinking in the daylight like people waking from a dream. But no one spoke his name. Not out of malice, out of reverence and guilt. He was no longer one of them. Not entirely. The shrine was sealed, the clay vessels buried, the effigies broken, the red canopy burned. Yao had passed in his sleep that morning, peaceful, unshackled. Min had dressed the body himself, folded the robe, tied the red thread around the wrists, not as a curse, but as respect. The villagers had stood in a circle, each placing a stone at Yao's feet, one for each sin remembered, one for each vow never fulfilled. When the final stone was placed, no one cried. They just turned and left. The old ways were over. Min stayed behind. He knelt in the center of the square where Yel's final echo had burned away the clay. There, in the dirt, something now grew. A single flower. White. Delicate. Impossible. It bloomed directly from the spot where she had stood. A funeral bloom, sacred in Taoist mourning. A sign that the spirit had passed through and found peace. He reached out and touched its stem. It pulsed, warm and alive. Not a ghost, a gift. He returned to the ancestral house one last time. The walls no longer groaned. The floor did not bleed. The urn remained sealed and still. But behind the altar something waited. A canvas of wet clay had been stretched across the wall by who he didn't know. But carved into its surface was a mural. You. Her full face. Her hand outstretched holding the hairpin. And beside her, Min, kneeling, hands open, unbound. Not a groom. Not a prisoner, just a boy who had remembered. The villagers asked him to stay, to teach them, to rebuild, to lead. But he declined. He packed nothing, took no coins, only a satchel and the clothing on his back. And in a small cloth pouch, tied with faded red thread, a single fragment of clay, the last piece of her first effigy, the one carved in pain, the one that survived the fire. Men left at dusk. No one stopped him. No one followed. The clay path had begun to grow over, reeds sprouting through the cracks, birds returning to the trees. But it welcomed him. Every footfall was soft, steady. The further he walked, the lighter he felt. The names of his ancestors faded from his shoulders. He was no longer carrying their silence, only hers. And she was not a burden. She was memory, alive now, untangled, free. He reached the edge of the mountain by nightfall, looked back once. The lanterns of Yuanxi glowed softly, but one glowed brighter than the rest, a blue flame flickering in the ancestral shrine. Not a threat, not a spirit, a vigil. She was remembered now, not as a ghost, not as a curse, but as you. At a crossroads beyond the village, he paused. There, standing beside a twisted tree, was a small shrine he didn't recognize. New, still warm from incense. Inside it, a small clay statue of a man, barefoot, in red robes, hands clasped gently with a bride. You. And beneath them, carved into the base, those who remember are never truly lost. Men smiled softly and kept walking.
Years passed. The name Yuanxi slowly vanished from maps, as it always had, like a wound the world learned to forget. The forest reclaimed the outer paths. The river changed course, whispering down new rocks, and the red clay road cracked, faded, and disappeared entirely. But the story never died, not in truth, not in silence. It waited the way all forgotten things wait, buried deep, pulsing softly beneath the skin of the earth, until someone touched it again. In a bustling city far from any mountain village, a little girl named Lian knelt beside her grandmother's old dresser. It was antique, dark wood, iron hinges, carved with unfamiliar patterns. She loved its mystery, the way the drawers stuck just slightly, like they were holding their breath. That day, while playing alone, she found a false panel at the bottom, and inside it, a hairpin, silver, delicate, its tip curved like a phoenix wing. Red thread still wrapped the base, frayed with age. She lifted it carefully, and as her fingers closed around it, a chill passed through the room. The overhead light flickered, the walls sighed, and from somewhere behind her, a whisper rose, so soft she wasn't sure if it was a voice or just the wind. "Do you know my name?" Lian brought the hairpin to her mother that evening. "Where did you get that?" her mother asked sharply. "In the old drawer. It was waiting." Her mother took it in shaking hands, then said too quickly, "It's just an heirloom, a trinket," and locked it in a box. But that night, the dreams came. Lian dreamed of red thread, of clay floors that pulsed with breath, of a woman in a white robe standing at the edge of a field, eyes like lanterns, hair moving with no wind. She didn't speak, she didn't move, but she watched. And Lian felt as though she had been chosen. Over the next week, the family dog refused to enter Lian's room. Mirrors fogged from the inside. Tiny footprints appeared on the floor by her bed. Bare, but patterned with ridges like cracked earth. One morning, her mother found her kneeling before the dresser, eyes closed, lips moving in a language no one in the household spoke. When asked, she only said, "She's teaching me." Far away, a storm rolled over a quiet forest. Rain fell on an abandoned shrine. Beneath the earth, deep in a place no map recorded, something stirred, a thread, red, frayed. It pulled once, then twice, then went still. In a museum warehouse, a restoration expert unboxed a donation from an anonymous source. Among the faded textiles and crumbling scrolls lay a ceramic urn, hairline cracks tracing its surface like veins. Inside, dust and a note. For those who remember. The expert blinked, turned, and in the reflection of the glass display case, she thought she saw someone behind her. A woman, red veil, bare feet. But when she turned, no one was there. In an alley 2 districts over, an old man swept the street in the early light. As he moved past a drain, something caught on his broom, something silver, a hairpin, tarnished, its thread now faded black. He picked it up, squinted, then dropped it as if it had burned him. He turned to go, and from the reflection of a puddle, a second pair of eyes stared back, waiting. And so it spreads, not with violence, not with vengeance, but with remembrance. A curse that no longer seeks punishment, only acknowledgement, only truth, only memory. She was never just a ghost. She was never the villain. She was the wound you never tended, the silence you passed down, the story you tried to bury in clay. They called her many things: bride, spirit, curse. But her name was always Yue. And now, wherever red thread touches old wood, wherever a mirror fogs with no breath, wherever someone unearths what was left to rot beneath a lie, she returns, not to haunt, but to ask softly, "Do you remember me now?"